This video is brought to you by Skillshare. As you probably already know, for the past few years, the Chinese economy has been struggling with a slow-burning property crisis. However, something you might not be aware of is the property crisis's impact on the country's banking system, which has been showing signs of stress as banks try to cope with falling land and property prices. While the CCP had, until recently, relied on ad hoc measures to keep smaller, more vulnerable banks afloat, a new strategy has since emerged. An unprecedented number of smaller banks are now being absorbed into larger ones, with 40 banks, about 1% of all rural banks, being consolidated in just the last week of June. So in this video, we're going to have a look at China's state-led banking system, how it's been affected by the property crisis, and how this might exacerbate China's deflationary woes. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. To understand this story, you need to know a bit about China's banking system. Broadly speaking, China's banking system can be split into three layers. At the top, you've got a handful of absolutely enormous megabanks. The best known of these are the so-called Big Four: the Bank of China, the China Construction Bank, the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, and the Agricultural Bank of China, although sometimes this list is expanded to include the Bank of Communications. According to Standard & Poor's, the Big Four are the largest four banks in the world by assets, with the Industrial and Commercial Bank holding assets representing nearly double that of JP Morgan, the largest non-Chinese bank in the world. All of these are considered state-owned, insofar as the CCP has controlling equity stakes of between 60 and 90% in each of them, and they collectively account for more than half of all banking activity in China. These banks mostly service big companies or local governments, and they're subject to constant supervision and oversight by the CCP. Beneath this layer of national megabanks, you've got a network of smaller province-level banks that are often closely affiliated with the relevant local government. These banks are still pretty big by normal standards, because, well, most Chinese provinces are the size of European countries and account for roughly a third of all banking activity. But then beneath these provincial banks, you've got a final layer of something like 4,000 small rural banks dotted across the Chinese countryside. These banks don't hold that much in assets. They account for only about 15% of all banked assets. But they play a crucial role in getting credit to the hundreds of millions of Chinese citizens that still live in the countryside. They're also more focused than the other larger banks on lending to households, because bigger banks are generally more focused on lending to companies, which means that these smaller banks are more important to creating and maintaining consumer demand. These banks are also more fragile than their larger equivalents, both because they don't have as deep pockets, but also because they're subject to less regulatory oversight, so they often engage in riskier lending practices. Unsurprisingly, China's ongoing property crisis has strained these banks' balance sheets. It's hard to find precise figures, but a large fraction of banks' lending will have been to property developers and mortgage holders. As property prices have fallen, both developers and households have stopped taking out loans and mortgages respectively, while the number of defaults has spiked, meaning less lending and less cash coming in for banks. On top of that, provincial and regional banks have lent significant amounts to local governments via local government financing vehicles, or LGFVs. In practice, this means they lend money to local governments while using long-term leases for land that's owned by local government as collateral. However, as property and land prices have fallen, the value of these banks' assets have declined, putting further strain on their balance sheets. Now, in the past, local governments would bail out failing regional banks with so-called special purpose bonds. In practice, this basically just meant that the relevant local government would borrow money and then buy up any non-performing or toxic assets on the bank's balance sheets, essentially shifting the risk from the small, fragile bank to the big, stable local government. However, this is no longer a tenable solution, for two reasons. First, local governments can't borrow as easily as they used to. This is in part because Beijing has become increasingly anxious about local governments' growing debt burdens, and have therefore put in place measures to limit how much they can borrow. But it's also because local governments' own balance sheets have been strained by the property crisis. Local governments have already taken out massive debts trying to meet the growth targets set by Beijing. But as land prices have fallen, their borrowing costs have spiked and made their debt crises much worse. Local governments are now in so much trouble that Beijing has had to bail some of them out and banned others from borrowing more money, which means they don't have the fiscal space to bail out these smaller banks. This is why, instead, they're being absorbed into larger banks with more oversight from the CCP. In Liaoning, for instance, 36 failing smaller banks were merged into one provincial-level bank set up by the CCP, called the Liaoning Rural Commercial Bank, and 5 smaller institutions have been set up to do similar things in other provinces. Now, to be clear, China's banking system is nowhere near a 2008-style financial meltdown. Nonetheless, the extent and pace of consolidation in the past few days suggests 2 things. First, that Chinese regional banks are in more trouble than most analysts might have previously assumed. But second, that China is moving away from the current fragmented regional banking model towards a more centralized state-led model. But while this might reduce the risk of further bank failures, it could still have a negative impact on China's ongoing deflation crisis. For context, for the past few months, China has been struggling with weak consumer demand, manifest as conspicuously low inflation rates, which has occasionally slipped into negative territory, i.e. deflation. The most recent data, which came out earlier this week, wasn't particularly encouraging in this respect. Year-on-year consumer inflation came in at just 0.2% in June, lower than the 0.3% high reached in May and the 0.4% forecast by Bloomberg. While low inflation might sound pretty lovely, in China it's demand-driven rather than supply-driven, i.e. it's not a consequence of oversupply, but rather of weak consumer demand, because Chinese households are struggling with falling house prices, low wages, and economic uncertainty. Folding smaller rural banks into larger ones could exacerbate this problem and increase the risk of a Japan-style deflationary crisis, because, as we mentioned, those smaller banks are more focused on lending to households, while bigger banks in China are generally focused on lending to companies, including the export-led manufacturing that dominates Chinese industry. This means that shifting from smaller banks to larger ones could further reduce households' purchasing power, while even potentially increasing China's export capacity, which has become increasingly controversial in global politics.
Running a profitable online news brand that gives away free content is a little tricky. So recently we launched an online store where you can purchase copies of our magazine Too Long. The thing is, setting up an e-commerce business is also pretty tricky. But fortunately, when it comes to websites and e-commerce, Skillshare is there to help. With me taking their very useful course, Shopify Essentials for Web Developers, when setting up the store. That's because Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives, with thousands of classes led by industry experts across film, illustration, design, freelance, productivity, and more. That means that Skillshare can help take your career, skills, hobbies, passions, or side hustles to the next level. There's hundreds of career-focused classes. That's courses from how to start a business to maximizing your workflow or digital marketing. The best news is that the first 500 people to use our link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial to Skillshare. So get started today.